Greetings, trombonists at large. I thought I'd take a bit of a break from things I don't like doing to do something that I like to do. Talk about trombones. So let's do that. Bass trombones today. Vincent Bach bass trombones. The first Vincent Bach bass trombone was the Bach 40B. Now, the 40B is an unusual horn. It's a dual bore trombone, but it is 525, 547, which is a little odd. But it is in very much within tradition of the design philosophy of Vincent Bach. And to understand that design philosophy, we have to know a little bit about Vincent Bach. Before we do that, let's talk about the trombones. The 50B is a trombone, is the current bass trombone, and it is bigger than these other three trombones, and I don't really want to talk about it. It's its own animal. But today we'll talk about the 40B, the 45B, and the 46B. All three of these trombones use the same bell section. As I talked about the bass model 12 and the bass model Bach 16 small bore, narrow trombone, narrow geometry trombones, they use the exact same bell section. It just has a different number stamped on the bell. Well, the Bach 40B, 45B, and 46B do the same thing. They all use the same bell section. They just have different diameter slides. Now, these Bach instruments, of course, the 40B is 525, 547. The 45B is 547 top and bottom, so it's a straight bore slide. And then the 46B is 547, 562 bottom, which is starting to sound a little more reasonable as far as bass trombones go. But the problem wasn't necessarily always the bore diameter of these instruments. It was the bell. The bell section on this instrument is larger than a 36 or a 42, but it is still smaller than eventually what the Bach 50B would become. It much more resembles an old-fashioned G bass trombone. Now, I played the G bass trombone one summer when I was living with my father in London for the summer. He was doing a show on the West End, and it's a story for another time. I could tell that story now. It's kind of a fun story, I guess, but it'll take too long. So suffice it to say, Vincent Bach was born in 1890 in Austria. And he started playing violin when he was a young man, and then later he started playing bugle, and then eventually he went to trumpet, rotary valve trumpet, and then cornet à piston. And as he played, he really liked it, and he decided he wanted to be a professional trumpet player. I don't want to talk too much about Vincent Bach because, again, he is a topic for another time, too. But just to touch on it, to get an idea of his sense musically that he brought to the New World when he came here and started his instrument company, we need to know that at that time, around the turn of the century, the B-flat bass trombone with rotor on it wasn't a very common instrument at all. They were still using the traditional G and F bass trombones. Most of the orchestral literature from the 1830s all the way into the 20th century was written for these instruments. If you ever wonder why Berlioz never wrote below a D flat, or Holst never wrote below a D flat, it's because those pieces were meant to be played on a G bass trombone. And I remember when I was in college, some kids were talking about the Impossible Lick by, who was it, Bartok. And I looked at them and I said, it's not impossible. You just play it on an F bass trombone. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they started to laugh. And they didn't know I was serious because I had played F bass trombone that summer, and I knew you could play it. You could play B natural to F on a straight horn without a valve. So again, sorry for another time, but those instruments were very small bored. The G bass trombone that I had, which they liked to refer to as my boozy, my Bella Boozy, was 525 bore top and bottom, and that was the slide they called the large slide. The other slide that it had was, I don't even know what the bore dimensions of it were. It was a dual bore slide, but it was smaller. It was under 500. I believe they said it was somewhere in 487 range, but I don't know if that was the largest bore or the smaller bore on top. I didn't like that slide, so I didn't take it, and I never measured it to find out that it was what it was. So I had a 525 bore slide for this straight G bass trombone. And the bell on that G bass trombone resembled very much the 72H bass trombone con that I was playing at the time, single valve 72H. And I loved that horn. Um, but I was playing, I remember the first time I went to that band to audition, or just to sit in, I brought my Con 72H bass trombone. And one of the trombonists who was setting up in front of me looked back and sneered and said, "Opera trombone." And I didn't know what he was talking about. You know, I was 15 years old and I was an idiot, so I didn't know what he was talking about. But later I would discover that the B-flat bass trombone with a valve was considered in early times to be the opera trombone. You see, in the mid to late 1800s, the composers and arrangers were starting to add more instruments to the symphony orchestras. They were adding trombones, they were adding more trumpets, they were adding more French horns. And because of this, space was getting tighter and tighter in these old symphony halls and opera concert halls and ballet halls. And they were having less and less space in the pit. And when you're trying to put a giant G bass trombone in there, or an F bass trombone, the G bass trombone stands about this tall to me when I'm standing up. But it was big and it was cumbersome and it was long. It had like a fireplace poker that I needed to attach to the slide so that I could play seventh position. And it had a great, unique sound. But these instruments were so big that the composers were adding these instruments. They wanted more space, so the companies, the opera companies, and the symphony companies were pressuring instrument manufacturers to come up with a solution, and they did. For the tenor trombone, they put a loop in the slide, so you have an opera tenor trombone which has an F attachment and a loop on the slide, so the slide only has 5 positions. So it was still fully chromatic because of the F attachment. You could play B flat, B natural, C, and then D flat in 5th. So you never needed 6th or 7th position because you had the F attachment. Later they discovered that if you just have the F attachment, you can have a normal length slide. It really doesn't take that much more space. A lot of instruments were owned by the companies, and you had your instrument that you owned and you played. But when you played for the opera company, oftentimes there were instruments that they would own and they would give them to you to play. And one of those instruments in Germany, they started experimenting with the idea of taking an oversized B-flat bass trombone and adding a valve to it so that it could still, in 6th position, play the D-flat. You see, the G bass trombone and the D-flat is the lowest note you can play on a bass trombone. I played the Planets, and that was written for G bass trombone. I remember on the part it even said G bass trombone. The lowest note on Mars is a D flat, 7th position. Ba da da, or no trigger actually. And on my 72H, I could still play it with 6th position and trigger. So that was what was going on with these instruments. And these were opera trombones, because that way you could have a bass trombone part, but it was still within the same footprint of a tenor trombone, which made them fit into the orchestra pit a little better. But what players discovered over time was not only was it able to fit in the same footprint, but it kind of sounded better too. And it had a little more flexibility because the slides were shorter, thus they had less inertia to overcome when you wanted to reverse the direction of the slide. And it was kind of a challenge playing with this hot dog skewer connected to the slide. I had to learn the technique for it and everything. Vincent Bach, being the good son, went to school as his parents wanted to, and he got an engineering degree. He also got certified to create mandrels, tool and tap and die mandrels, which would come in very handy for him once he became an instrument builder, because he was able to design his own mandrels, which saved him a lot of cost. But after he got out of school, he also worked in an instrument factory making and repairing brass instruments while he was going to school. Well, after he got out of school, he decided he wanted to pursue his playing career, and so he started going around in Europe, and he was playing in brass bands and orchestras and doing various types of things. But the winds of war were starting to blow in Europe, and he decided that he was in London at the time. He was playing with a brass band, and he decided that he didn't want to be categorized as a foreign alien, and so he took an audition for the Boston Symphony, and he got a auxiliary position to play trumpet with Boston. Well, when the war broke out, he ended up going to New York, and then he eventually ended up getting drafted into the U.S. Army. But because he was a foreign national, he could not serve. He couldn't go into active duty, so he was just a trumpet player in the band during World War One. After World War One, he got out, and then he started making mouthpieces in the back room of a Selmer dealer on his own lathe that he bought, and then he eventually started manufacturing his own instruments, and then in 28, 29, he designed his trombone line. Well, the bass trombone that he first designed, which was not until 1930, was the 40B bass trombone, and it was very much one of these German-style opera bass trombones. It was in B flat, had a wide slide, and it was set up like all Stradivarius trombones with nickel cork barrels, yellow slide tubes with nickel oversleeves, asymmetric, with nickel silver ferrule rings with a yellow brass crook, or bow, I mean, and the bayonet and the water key were both nickel silver, coming up to the hand brace, which was also the larger bass connector, not hand brace, the connector, which was nickel silver, which led to the rotary valve connected to the F attachment, which was in yellow brass with nickel silver ferrules and nickel silver slide tube for the E-pole slide on the F attachment, going out into a yellow brass gooseneck to nickel silver tuning slides, yellow brass bow, and then nickel silver furniture with nickel silver braces, and finally a yellow brass 9-inch round wire soldered bead. Now, just because that was the bass instrument doesn't mean that those are the instruments that you will find. Even the most common ones that we'll find today. That was the bass model. If you called him up on the phone or wrote him a letter or sent him a telegram and said, I want a 40B, that's what you would get. Oftentimes these instruments were bought in lots for bands and for other kinds of things, and oftentimes for a single individual as well. But they would option those instruments out. So they would get French beads or gold brass bells. Sometimes they would get oversized valves. Sometimes they would do ambron slides, things like that. So you'll find a lot of variation in these early horns because they were typically special order. But the 40B was his first foray into bass trombones, and it had that smaller G bass trombone type of bell, where the end of the tail is, the stem is rather narrow, but then it opens up very quickly into the throat. So it's got this very big expansion that comes out into the flare of the 9-inch bell. And the two examples that I've seen, I've never seen a 40B. I've only seen a 45 and a 46. I played them. And the 45 had a 9-inch bell, but the 46 had a 9 and about a 1/4-inch bell because it had a French bead on it. Now, the French bead, again, is what Bach would refer to today as the flat bead, but it's got a wire in it. A truly flat bead has no wire in it. But the French bead, I actually like the French bead. I think it gives me a little more resonant feedback, but it just may be all in my crazy head. But these bells were very open at the throat, but very tight through the tuning slide. And because of that, they got a kind of a characteristic sound. They were also a little stuffy. But, you know, they didn't play that much differently than my old G-bass trombone, my old Boozy, that I played when I was in London for 2.5 months playing in a band. But I was living with my dad. I was just playing in the band for fun. Because of that, that was a restriction that was always going to hamper these 40 series bass trombones. The 45 bass trombone had the same bell again, but it had a 545. 547 bore. 545 straight slide. It had, however, uniform oversleeves on the slide. That was done because it gave the instrument a little more togetherness. Because when you started to play loud on these horns, they got kind of fracky. And that extra weight on the top slide of the nickel oversleeve kind of helped keep the instrument together. So we had the 545, 547 bore, 5 single bore slide mated to this Bach 40B bell, and it was the Model 45. The Model 46, interestingly, now the one that I played, had a 45 bell, but the slide said 46 on it. The reason why was because my dad had a friend in New York who owned a lot of bass trombones, a lot of different kinds. He was a bass trombone player. And so we went to his house and I had my 72H and he thought that was cool. But then I saw these other horns and he brought them out so I could try them. And the 46 was interesting. It actually played pretty well. But again, it was just a little stuffy. And it had a gold brass bell with a French bead and was about 9¼ inches. And it had the slide said 46, but the bell said 45. And I asked him, "Did you change it?" And he said, "No, that's how it came from the factory when I ordered it." He had ordered it before, just before the war, I believe it was, and World War II. And he said that that's how it came from the factory. It came with a 45 bell, and the slide said 46, and it was a 547, 562 dual bore slide. And interestingly, I could put that dual bore slide onto his single valve 50B bell section and they would mate up, and it played so much better. So it wasn't the slide, it's the bell. And I remember having a conversation with Larry Minnick. I had this single valve 72H, and I was talking to Larry and saying, I'd like to be able to kick out a B natural without having to pull the E pull on the 62H. And I said, and he kind of looked at me and sneered, and I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, you got a 73H, right?" And I said, "Yeah, but I like the 72H better." And he said, "They're the same bell. They're the same bell, and it won't work. Yeah, but I'll do it for you if you want me to ruin your horn." And I thought, well, okay, Larry, but why? And he said, "It's too small. There's not enough resonant room through the gooseneck into the tuning slide and out that taper. The stem of the bell is too small to really support those larger wavelengths for the low C and low B without feeling stuffy or getting blasty or overblowing through the bell section." And he said, "You'd be better off getting a Bach 50." And so I went out and got a Bach 50, and it solved my problems, except the story for a Bach 50 is for another time. But the 72H bell section looked a lot like the Bach 45 bell section, which looked a lot like my old Boozy. But the 45 had faster expansion. I've heard these horns mentioned as being bass trombone, tenor trombone, dual combination instruments, and no. These were purpose-built, designed, and created to be bass trombones. And for Vincent Bach, these were cutting edge for the European standard. But we also have to remember that the European standard was smaller bore diameters. The largest tenor trombone you'd find in a symphony orchestra would be a 525 bore horn, which is one of the reasons why Bach didn't design a larger tenor trombone than 525 for the Bach 36. He felt that was the pinnacle of tenor trombones. But as we know, in the United States, it was the Wild West. Many bands, such as Alexander's Ragtime Band and other band leaders like John Philip Sousa, were putting pressure on the instrumentalists to play bigger, play louder. And the instrumentalists, in turn, were going to manufacturers and requesting larger instruments at around, before the turn of the century. So in the United States, it was kind of the Wild West. The 8H, Con 8H, was actually first designed and introduced in 1919, very early. And so when Vincent Bach got here, his concepts for not only tenor trombone but bass trombone were already outdated. These instruments exist on a branch of our trombone family tree, which had kind of withered and faded away. Now, in modern day, people are starting to play those G bass trombones again, but I don't think that the 70 series Cons nor the 40 series Bach bass trombones will ever be popular again, because they were kind of a compromise to figure out a better way to get the G bass trombone or the F bass trombone to play with more facility and to just fit in your band, so you didn't have to move people out of the way without wiping out the music stand behind you or breaking someone's head in front of you or hitting them in the, actually it was more likely you were going to hit them in the ankle with a slide because the horns were so front heavy. But again, story for another time. So the Bach 40 series bass trombones were hindered by the dimensions of their tuning bow and the throat of the bell, the stem of the bell. And they would never be able to become modern bass trombones, just as the 70 series cons were never able quite to make it there because they were just too small at this stem of the bell. However, because he had this 547 bore instrument and the introduction of the 8H, 88H, in the 1950s, 1951, started putting pressure on Vincent Bach to come up with an instrument that was on par with these much more popular, larger bore tenor trombones. And so all he did was take the 547 bore, all he did was take the dual bore, the single bore 547 45B and mate it with the tuning slide and the bell section of his Bach 36 tenor trombone. So the Bach 42 and the Bach 36 share the same bell mandrel as do the 12 or these 40 series bass trombones. The Bach 45B shares the same slides, gooseneck and F attachment as the Bach 42. This was kind of an instrument that was cobbled together because oftentimes we will find that with Bach's instruments, he's chasing the trend in the United States, not really setting one. And that reason why is because he had this older musical concept in his head about the reasons for these various trombones, but that is a topic for another time. So the Bach 40B, 45B, and 46B bass trombones are interesting novelties in our modern world, but not really successful trombones, and don't even think about using them as tenors. They don't work as tenors. The throats are too big. They've got a very openy kind of unfocused sound. I would say that it's not a very pretty sound, especially when you're trying to play loud, because of the odd taper of that Bach 40 series bell. But if you ever wondered why the 42 is surrounded by bass trombones, 40 and 45 and 46, it's because it's utilizing the slide, the valve section, and the gooseneck of the 45 mated to the tuning slide and the bell section of a Bach 36. So, I hope you found this interesting, and maybe I'll see you on the bandstand.